Good morning, and today I have with us once again my lovely colleague, lovely lady. Good morning, lovely lady.
Good morning.
So today's topic is the spirit behind the American Constitution. Much talked about these days. So ostensibly, the American Revolution was a war against oppression. Its success signifying the victory of the human spirit and the inalienable right of the individual to find their place under the sun. However, this was not applied equally. In the words of George Orwell, some were more equal than others. This we all know. So this courtesy not being extended at the time to the blacks and the First Nations.
Well, how does that play out today?
Well, the reason why we're talking about it is because really 200 years later, 200 plus years later, we're essentially in the same place. Today, when those groups who were left out, the blacks and the First Nations, wish to be extended these same rights afforded the rest, more than nominally, but actually, they are encouraged to express themselves through peaceful protest, which they have done. So the First Nations applied peaceful protest and observed the rule of law largely over the last couple of hundred years, and really the result being that they secured their place at the bottom of the social totem pole. And ironically, had the Patriots of 1776 applied this same restraint, this peaceful protest approach, would we even have a United States today, or a constitution to speak of? And in a sense, this is yet another variation of what I refer to in another podcast as the high road trick.
Could you explain to our viewers what you mean by the high road trick?
Well, it is when those in power convince those, the usurpers, those who wish to acquire power, to play by rules that are rigged in favor of they themselves. So when we speak of the spirit behind the Constitution, we are not speaking of a simple idea which is then expressed, in other words, a singular idea, which is then expressed through the entire document. No, it's something far different than that. Instead, it is really a fusion of somewhat competing ideas. So on the one hand, we have the ideas of the philosopher Locke, one of the prominent philosophers, British philosophers of the 18th century. And his basic principles of good government are really the underpinning of the wording, as you can see, those being life, liberty, and the protection of property. Now, when we come to the third, it's quite interesting because meanwhile, in the Declaration of Independence, this protection of property is replaced with the pursuit of happiness. Of course, not a kind of narcissistic happiness, but an individual's right to follow his calling. This being a tip of the hat to the French philosophers of the late 18th century, les philosophes, and probably largely influenced by such founders as Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine. Now, it's almost immediately obvious that these two concepts are very different. Protecting property relates to the protection of the status quo, because who had property? While the pursuit of happiness relates to individual freedom, and therefore one would expect it to be extended to all the population.
How are they then to reconcile the two?
Well, there is no true way to reconcile them. However, they did not really envisage this to be provided to all men, even at the outset. If we apply wishful thinking and give them the benefit of the doubt, we can assume that this franchise, this universal franchise, was eventually going to be extended to the rest of the population over time. However, when we look historically, for them to do so would have been to sacrifice their privilege and their status, and they collectively, something that they collectively enjoyed within their own society. So when we look at this, when in history does a ruling elite freely relinquish their privilege? It is only under extreme duress, on the brink of revolution, that they would ever do so. And at the most, they might mitigate their advantage, or at least appear to give away their advantage. And really, even then, only superficially. But to simply discard the advantaged position that they have enjoyed and they have inherited by virtue of their ancestors' valor, hard work, or cunning, never. Thank you. So we'll leave off there for this morning, and we'll be continuing in the next podcast on the second part. Thank you.